Final Fight! Final Fight! Final Fight! Final Fight! Final Fight!
Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game SO. Today we're continuing series on the Final Fight franchise. We review every single game as a retrospective fashion, and obviously 2 comes after 1, so we're talking about the original Final Fight on Super Nintendo, which would be Final Fight 2. Cody and Guy are completely missing, which is strange because Guy's fiance gets kidnapped in the storyline, and apparently he was busy that week and just didn't decide to help. But the Mad Gear gang is back. We're going to go across the entire world trying to fight them and rescue the hostages. And to say that Capcom had big shoes to fill when it comes to a Final Fight sequel, that would be an absolute understatement, because the arcade original is just one of those Hall of Fame level good games that everyone has played at least once. And even though Final Fight is always considered to be an arcade franchise, only the first game ever came out on an arcade board. Everything else from here is home console, unless you count Final Fight Revenge being on the Sega Titan video. But this game had to do a lot to basically live up to the hype of the original Final Fight, and I would say for the most part it definitely does that. But if you play the games back-to-back, Final Fight then Final Fight 2, especially if you're capturing footage for retrospective, you will feel the differences between arcade hardware and the Super Nintendo. Because as pretty as Final Fight 2 is, and as good as the Super Nintendo is at drawing an image to the screen, it definitely isn't a Capcom CPS system, because that has a lot more power. But the gameplay has come over, all of the fun of the arcade original has come over, and obviously we have a completely expanded story, and we're going to be traveling around the entire world to try to take down the Mad Gear gang, and that is always fun. Now this game definitely feels very similar to the original, but you're going to see stuff like this, being able to scroll up and down on the screen, things that you didn't really see in the arcade version of the game. And this game absolutely sold a metric crap ton as well, going over 1 million copies, so you know there was a lot of demand for another Final Fight game. And interestingly, again, this never came to arcades, which is very interesting to me. I would have expected to see a CPS2 version of this game and then a Super Nintendo port, but maybe the market just wasn't there in arcades at that point in time, and Capcom felt the easy money was making a Super Nintendo game, because obviously with over 1 million copies sold, they were not wrong in making that money. And all of the moves, all of the combat for Hagar here, the only proper way to play the game in my opinion is with Mike Hagar, feel just as good as they did on the arcade original. So as far as all of the gameplay is concerned, it is 100% as good as that first game. But you will see here, sometimes the visual are a little lacking. You would expect those waves to move in the background, and when we get to Final Fight 3 you are going to see some more effects in the overall image, which are definitely going to work a little bit better for that world building. And it is kind of strange feeling to go to France in a Final Fight game, because the first game and the third game are going to take place in Metro City, where this one kind of just basically traverses the world. And while the graphics are great, and I do love the stages, seeing Mike Hagar fight in France always felt maybe like 10% funny to me. Not in a bad way, just in a kind of strange way. Now the one thing that I wish this game did a little bit more with is enemy diversity. Once you get past like halfway through the second stage, you're going to basically see every single enemy the game has to offer you outside of the different diverse bosses. So by the time you get to the 35-40 minute mark, you probably destroyed 35 to 40 Endores and hundreds of different scrub enemies, but you've only really fought maybe 5 or 6 designs, which makes sense. Obviously a Super Nintendo cartridge and its ROM size is going to be much smaller than an arcade board, but I wish there was a tiny bit more diversity in the overall enemy layout. But again, I'm just kind of nitpicking this a little bit at the beginning, because this is an incredible game and it is such a great follow-up to the arcade original, and I love the personality it has on display here. All of these soldiers in the hangar basically cheering this fight on against Freddy. The bosses here are huge, they're epic, their sprites are big, and they're just as much fun as the arcade original. And once you get to Final Fight 3, I would say the boss fights suffer a little bit, both in hit detection and overall character design. So this one has that same level of polish on the enemies and the levels as the arcade original did, even if technically it is a quote-unquote downgrade from CPS hardware. The one area in which this game I do think could be slightly better though is a little bit more interesting of a soundtrack. Because the soundtrack in the original was so good, this one doesn't sound as good to my ear, but hey, you get to beat up a car and that's never boring. Go ahead and listen, and I'll be right back with more. I mean, the music is a solid B+ tier effort, and it does sound good coming out of the Super Nintendo sound hardware, but I think the tracks in the arcade original are so incredibly iconic, weighing them against anything else that would come after just isn't going to do it a very good service, and that is the thing. The arcade original is so beloved that comparing anything against it, you're obviously going to have some nostalgia for that arcade original that maybe you don't have as much for this sequel, because I would have to say back in the day, I remember renting this from Blockbuster and having a fun time with it, but I played the arcade original way more than I ever did play Final Fight 2 or Final Fight 3. But leave me a comment down below and you tell me, what was the first Final Fight game you played and where did you play it? Because I'm assuming most people are going to say the arcade, but I bet more people played it at a home console port or one of these sequels than they did the original, because obviously Final Fight came over to Super Nintendo, definitely a modified port that took a lot of the arcade original bits out of it, but one that pretty much everyone played. So it'll be interesting to hear your guys' feedback as to where you first saw this franchise. But as we come down here and end up using Carlos, I would say the new additions to the roster suffer a little bit in my opinion versus Cody and Guy. Would have rather just had the same cast from the first game, because again, it is very strange as far as the story is concerned for Guy's fiance to be kidnapped and for him to be nowhere to be found. It kind of feels like he actually doesn't care about his fiance, and that Capcom just felt like they had to give you different characters, which I would definitely disagree with. Just give me Cody and Guy back and I would be very happy. But Bracken here as a boss, definitely as every bit as charming as some of the bosses from the original. Kind of feels like a pirate version of a Frankenstein monster, has some pirate gear on, at least in my opinion, but has that same weird brow that Frankenstein would bring across, and it is a very interesting and unique design that feels a little bit different than the first game. But it makes sense that the developers would have changed up a little bit of what made Final Fight so popular, at least in the design aspect, because they didn't want the game just to feel like a complete retread of original territory. They wanted to give you something new to see and do while maintaining that same genre, and they did a highly effective job here. But this game definitely takes a lot longer to beat than the arcade original, so depending on how many minutes in a row of a beat 'em up you want to play, maybe around the 35 to 40 minute mark, this game could feel like it's slightly dragged. So it is the type of situation where if you want that concise half an hour beat 'em up, definitely play the original game. But as far as a sequel on Super Nintendo, it is highly effective, and I know that was not an easy challenge for the developers. Trying to make a sequel to one of the most popular and successful arcade games of all time was always going to be difficult, but in some ways I think this game can look better than the arcade original. This train sequence here, while you have the city skyline in the background, while the train is rumbling by and you're having a fight on top of it, it is just such a great set piece, especially for the Super Nintendo. It is one of those moments in this game where I feel like it does outshine the arcade original in some spots. But one more soundtrack sample just so you can compare it against what came before from the original video on Final Fight, because this track here I do prefer a little bit more than the one I gave you a sample of about 4 minutes ago. So enjoy! Definitely some fun music, but don't ask me why Felipe the Clown was there. It doesn't really fit anything Final Fight themed. I guess I just wanted to go with a clown. And that is the thing about Final Fight 2. For 9 things that remind you of the original, there's going to be one thing that kind of stands out. Maybe you'll love it, maybe you'll hate it, but it is going to be different. And I really do appreciate that Final Fight 3 returns back to Metro City, keeping that as the focus as far as where you're actually having these battles. Because it is fun that the Mad Gear Gang is back. It's fun that we have Final Fight back, and this was an excellent game. It just kind of feels like the odd man out in the Final Fight franchise. And of course Final Fight 3 back in the day would review worse than this game, but it was basically because people were a little bit tired of the formula back then. And as you use Maki here to fight against Rolento, it is a fun game, don't get me wrong. I still think this is an incredible 9.5 out of 10 experience. I would just say that as far as home releases on Final Fight are concerned, the development team kind of got the hang of it a tiny bit more when they got to Final Fight 3, but you can leave a comment down below and you tell me. Final Fight 2 or Final Fight 3, I would be curious. But but this is just the type of franchise we've been playing for the longest time, and I remember seeing previews in magazines back in the day. The Final Fight 2 was coming, and I was every bit as excited for it as I was the arcade original, and still to this day when I play it, I have a smile on my face, especially if I bring a friend along for the ride. Final Fight definitely needs a Final Fight 4 because we obviously have a Streets of Rage 4, and it feels like Final Fight one day should get to that number 4 as well, but it seems like Capcom just wants to make remakes of Resident Evil games these days. And if for some reason you've never played Final Fight 2 before, definitely give it a go. It is a metric crap ton of fun. You're going to have a great time with it. Just don't play the arcade original right before you play number 2, or else you might consider them a little bit too different. But short of that, we are done. I'll have videos of the week, and we'll have Final Fight 3 next week. Bye-bye.